Everyone agrees the number of people suffering from depression has been increasing steadily over the last century. In the early 20th century, less than 1% of the population experienced a period of depression in their lives. By the middle of the century, among those born in the 1950s, 6% of the population had suffered a depressive episode before the age of 30. And today, we estimate that 1 person in 5, 20% of the population, will experience depression at some point in their lives. This is something significant, something we see in every country worldwide, and this really needs to be examined.
Depression is everywhere. We see the same story on the front page of newspapers, hear it regularly on radio programs. You can catch depression as you could catch the flu in the winter. This medical term, once reserved for patients in psychiatric hospitals, came into widespread use barely 50 years ago. Now, people even speak of a worldwide epidemic.
There is not a single region of the world which can be described to be free from depression. So depression is common, it occurs everywhere, anybody could get affected, and it is a disease.
The new figures suggest as much as 350 or 400 million people globally have this condition, and it's not usual feelings of sadness or feelings of, of distressed or depressed mood that we all get from time to time in our everyday lives. It's something much more severe and serious than that. It's a clinical disorder, not just a passing mood.
Depression has been found to be the second most disabling condition in the world when you compare with other health conditions. And that's something which requires a lot of emphasis, because it is not often recognized to be that important. That's something which I think common people should understand, that depression is there, it can cause disability, but more importantly, it can be identified and treated. That's the message.
What happened to get us to this point? How can we explain these alarming figures? How did our society start producing large-scale depression? One of the countries most recently affected by the spectacular rise in cases of depression is Japan. The word depression, largely unknown to most people, suddenly entered the public sphere in the early 2000s. Since then, the number of individuals diagnosed with depression has skyrocketed from 250,000 to 1 million.
Last autumn, I started to have a lot of work. I was working every day, without any time off. For several days I couldn't fall asleep, even though I was very tired. I think that's why I became depressed.
How did you manage to maintain your sleep cycle and take time to sleep?
Whenever I could, I tried to find some time during the day to rest on the office sofa.
You didn't have any weekends.
I couldn't take any because things could happen at any moment.
And how will you manage when you go back to work?
Above all, I have to keep taking my medication so I don't relapse.
When I see the way depression has spread today, I remember that in 1997, in the United States, where I was studying depression, everyone was talking about it, taking Prozac, while in Japan, it never came up. Starting in 1998, however, the suicide rate reached record levels and has remained high for 13 years. So people started to wonder if depression wasn't one of the primary causes of the suicides.
The nation became aware of the issue in 2000, when for the first time a company, Dentsu, the most prestigious ad agency in Japan, was found guilty in court and therefore responsible for the suicide of one of its employees who had been overworked.
The number of suicides was more than 30,000 people per year. That's why the conviction in the Dentsu case affected the Japanese people so strongly.
The number of these trials has increased since then, and the Japanese began to believe that depression was the primary explanation for the significant increase in suicides. A causal link was therefore established between overwork, depression, and suicide.
This is the news from the NHK channel.
So since then, depression has become more widely known in Japan. And then, under the combined effect of suicide prevention campaigns and ads for antidepressants that appeared in 1999, it suddenly became a major illness recognized by the general public.
The government and companies have made some progress, but nothing has changed in terms of working hours in the last 10 years. People are paying attention to the young, especially since the Ishizawa case.
My son was a happy, funny young man. We used to get together every evening at Utsunomiya, where he lived. One day, shortly before he died, my son wanted to give all his savings to his little brother. When I heard that, I thought it was strange. At the end, he was saying he was a loser, all because he couldn't achieve the figures demanded by the company. I spoke to my son about it, but I didn't know at the time that his situation was so critical. At my son's funeral, the head of the company came to bow before his body to offer his condolences. Right after, his secretary said, "Chief, it's time to go." He had another meeting. I was disappointed with his behavior, and right then decided to discover the truth.
I talked to his friends to hear what they had to say. He had never consulted any psychiatrists during his life. So I concluded that he committed suicide because of the mental problems caused by overwork.
I
don't know much about how suicide is viewed in the West. But in Japan, with the samurai, it was considered more as an honorable act in our culture. This way of thinking has remained with the Japanese. We tend not to judge those who commit suicide as fragile people or those who have succumbed to an illness.
But over the last 15 years, as more and more people show an interest in depression, the romantic idea of suicide has evolved. I have the feeling that perception has changed. Before, without any doubt, suicide was viewed as an act of free will. Now we're starting to think that the cause of it may be depression.
The Japanese are not the only people facing a significant increase in the number of depressed people. The European Alliance Against Depression, created in Germany, includes 15 European countries and is run by Professor Ulrich Hegerl, director of the Psychiatric Clinic of Leipzig and a regular consultant to the pharmaceutical industry. Is the number of depressed individuals rising in Germany as it is in Japan? Or are these constantly increasing figures merely the result of more active screening techniques?
First of all, is depression more common? Or do the survey methods used give us a skewed view? We were able to work with national health care data, and for 2006, depression was diagnosed among more than 780,000 people from an insured population numbering 8 million. In many countries, it seems as if the general public feels that depression is increasing. This is certainly linked to the fact that, overall, medical care for individuals is better. This means that there are more people who have access to the public health system, among whom depression will be identified and diagnosed. More people are now in psychotherapy, and more people are taking antidepressants.
The Alliance created an awareness-raising program to train and inform patients, doctors, social workers, and the media about depression and the risk of suicide. This program is now in place in more than 100 regions in Germany and around Europe.
Ja, schönen guten Morgen.
Warum ich die Weiterbildung gemacht habe oder mich dafür interessiere? Ja, erstens, weil das
Why am I doing this training and why am I interested? First of all, because it is our field, our work. We often work with depressed individuals. And I have a personal interest in the subject. And the fact that we do not have to take on everything by ourselves, but that we can share certain things with a team in meetings like this one during this training session is exactly why I do this, why we do this with the association.
Another terrifying figure that illustrates why we need an alliance against depression is the increase of more than 100% among young adults. Among women, it happens even earlier. There's an explanation. Men always consult doctors later.
My depression was not so serious that I couldn't get out of bed. It was nothing like what I have sometimes seen in certain people who are ill. For me, it was very different. Socially, I have a lot of friends, which is not true of many sufferers, and this is an important factor for me. My son plays soccer, and 2 or 3 years ago, the goalkeeper for the Hanover club, Robert Enke, committed suicide, depression. He threw himself in front of a train. My son heard about it. It was even in the newspapers for children. And this was also a goalkeeper he had seen play. My son knows depression. He heard that I was suffering from depression. So obviously he picked up on it. He worried, was anxious, always asking, "Where's Papa? What's he doing now?" We've been very open with the children. They have lived through all this. They have understood. We have always been clear with them. And my son is always a bit of a worrier. He has become calmer. I think it is very important to involve everyone.
These screening techniques, which have been set up in an increasing number of regions worldwide according to a protocol strongly recommended by the WHO, mean that more people consult their doctors. And all these new diagnoses become part of the statistics. But let's take a closer look at how these programs operate, and especially how they define the illness.
The most complicated question in the world is how do you define depression, because it's used in so many different ways. The standard way for doctors to define depression is to use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which has a set of criteria that give the symptoms that are most characteristic of depression. And these include things like sadness, loss of interest, trouble sleeping, trouble with appetite, loss of energy, hopelessness about the future, a sense of pessimism about your current life, and a feeling of failure about your past life. Very often this is combined with a feeling of helplessness, of worthlessness, and in the most severe cases, the person is completely incapacitated, has great difficulty doing anything that would be part of their normal life. The mood is worse than anything they've ever felt, worse than losing the person you love most in the world.
The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is in fact a large dictionary. Therefore, an extremely practical manual intended for clinicians to help them determine a diagnosis. In this case, for depression, among the 8 classic symptoms, a patient must experience 4 of them on a nearly daily basis for the diagnosis to be made. What's new about this manual is that, for the first time in the history of psychiatry, each clinician must follow strict guidelines in determining a diagnosis.
Before 1980, 2 psychiatrists seeing the same patient would never agree on the diagnosis. Catastrophe for the field. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual was an effort to get clinicians to work off the same page. And this led to a tremendous increase in the reliability of diagnosis.
What is entirely new with the DSM, which will have a significant impact on our culture, is that patients no longer really need a psychiatrist to know what they are suffering from. They can consult the DSM themselves, either in a library or online. Everyone can very easily learn about the signs of depressions by searching for Depression Definition DSM, and anyone can easily obtain this list.
The problem to some degree begins as psychiatry legitimately sees the opportunity to help more people and moves out from the asylum to the community. As psychiatry becomes an outpatient profession, and at that point the mental health professions, social workers, psychologists, marriage and family therapists, all these different professions go into the community to help people, you suddenly have a new problem that you never had before.
The DSM is so easy to use that everyone can consult it, and although initially reserved to professionals, it is now widely used. Structures now exist that offer immediate diagnoses based on simple questionnaires. In theory, a commendable process.
You're seeing a sneak peek of what our new programming is going to look like, so it's really exciting. We're very excited about it. It's going to be quick. This isn't going to take 2 hours. It's going to take 2 minutes. Let's get started. So they choose a screening, let's say depression.
I've been involved in one way or another with DSMs now for 35 years, starting with being a participant in the development of DSM-3, one of the leaders in the development of DSM-3R in 1987, then the head of the task force for DSM-4 in 1994, and then I've been very critical of the last rendering of the DSM system, DSM-5, over the course of the last 4 years. We made a serious mistake in DSM-3. We lumped together the very most severe depressions, called melancholic depressions, where there was a tremendous change in the patient's mood state, severe agitation, lethargy, inability to function, often delusions, very severe problems. We lumped them together with very mild problems. We thought that we could handle this because there was subtyping and severity ratings, but these two in the public mind have been lumped together.
Over the past 2 weeks, how often have you been feeling low in energy or slowed down? And people will just start answering these questions over the past 2 weeks. How often have you been blaming yourself for things? Been feeling hopeless about the future? Been feeling blue?
Many things are being put together in that. In particular, problems that we could perhaps better call demoralization, that can still be very difficult for people, but that reflect their social predicament, are being lumped together. So that's one concern. And the other concern is what we talked about earlier again, the idea that the depression becomes this idiom of distress, this way of reframing everyday malaise and difficulties, and that's also being lumped together. So you have mild problems being called depression, you have serious problems that are not depression being called depression, and you have this core of things which I do believe we could probably find in most or all places in the world that are part of human vulnerability that we're calling depression.
We really want to see mental health discussed and treated with the same gravity as physical health. That's our goal, that's our vision, is this world in which that happens.
In a way, the entire mental health system when it comes to depression, the whole system of research, treatment, screening and treatment that encompasses so many people is based on this one DSM definition. And when that definition got stretched, perhaps for the best of intentions, it created an entire system that is linked to pharmaceutical manufacturers, is linked to public health, is linked to all those statistics in a way that creates this power structure that entirely seems legitimate.
So certainly in years past, we have been fortunate enough to have some funding from pharmaceutical companies that have allowed us to bring our screenings to a national level. We don't have people's names written all over everything. It's not plastered there. We tend to work more with the charitable arms of pharmaceutical organizations if we're going to work with them. But that's something we've really worked hard to retain, is that this is a service that we know mental health screenings do work and they do get people to appropriate treatment options. It doesn't need to be, stamped with some pharmaceutical company's name all over it, but there's pros and cons, and one of the pros is that many years ago it allowed us to bring these things at a national level.
The drug companies learned that the most effective way to sell pills is to sell ills, to diseasemonger. And so they drove home the message that depression was a very common, unrecognized state. And in fact, they convinced people who had the problems of everyday life that they were really clinically depressed and required psychiatric treatment.
Where does depression hurt? Everywhere. Who does depression hurt? Everyone. Did you know that depression hurts emotionally and physically? Not everyone looks at depression that way. Tell your doctor if your depression worsens or you have thoughts of suicide.
With the publication of the DSM, the number of people diagnosed with depression and the number of prescriptions for antidepressants has soared. The use of antidepressants has virtually doubled in OECD countries between 2000 and 2011, even though we are not able to confirm that the actual number of people with depression has increased to the same degree. Are we now treating sadness and angst as illnesses more than we should, at the risk of creating additional suffering?
I decided to become a psychiatrist because I've always been interested in mental illness. As for specializing in the field of depression, it was because this psychological illness is the one that normally can most readily be treated, but also because I have always had a soft spot for sad, depressed, and anxious people. The unique aspect of this clinic is that we take patients who have been diagnosed as depressed by several doctors, not just by themselves, and who, despite 5, 10, or even 20 years of medical treatment, have not gotten better. Among them is a significant number of people who, while they were just going through a difficult and demoralizing period in their lives, experienced a serious downturn in their psychological health, precisely because of the treatments and medication they started taking conscientiously from that point on.
うつはどこが辛くなるでしょう。さまざまなところです。うつは誰が辛くなるでしょう。さまざまな人です。
ただうつ病というのはある一定の
Because people are diagnosed as depressed merely by complying with a list of defined criteria, many of them are unfortunately included in a definition that is far too all-encompassing. The medications we use are not as effective or as safe as we think they are, and in fact present serious risks. What's more, much of the data that doctors have concerning the safety and effectiveness of the drugs is clearly biased, exaggerating the benefits while minimizing the risks or even concealing important facts. How are you today? Do you feel well?
Yes, I feel better than before.
And how about the medication you're taking? Is It effective?
Right now, I don't see any difference in terms of the depression. But I feel that it works very well against anxiety. I can't do without them if I want to live a normal life. And it's also very effective against pain. If I didn't have these drugs, it would be very hard to get by because it is really painful. Maybe they are essential for me. I would like my life to become more normal. I would like to be able to go out, able to do housework and see my friends.
I think it's probably appropriate to use antidepressants for patients suffering from severe chronic depression, an illness which, in my opinion, is more the domain of psychiatry. I think we are wrong to think that everyone diagnosed with depression, according to the DSM-5, needs antidepressants.
WHO and the NIMH, National Institute of Health in the United States, have a vested interest in mental disorder being very common and causing a great deal of disability because that's how their budgets are developed. The more impairment is due to mental disorder, the more frequent is mental disorder, the more money they'll be able to get to study mental disorder. Now, I'm all for that. I think there's way too little funding that goes into the research and in the treatment of people who are mentally ill. But I think that the numbers are way exaggerated.
You have to understand that for the WHO, this idea of a disabling illness is a sort of marketing tool. We're talking here about disease mongering.
But I'm going to tell myself all the time, love yourself, love your life. It would be good if I could manage to exist without giving up on life.
Don't lose hope. We tend to think that early screening and treatment is a good thing. But the problem is that more and more people who really don't need excessive treatment become dependent, which ends up aggravating this illness. I've recently been wondering if we, as psychiatrists, we shouldn't be targeting our patients better in order to provide help only to those who truly need it, without implicating the entire society at large.
To a large extent, mental illnesses are no longer only the domain of psychiatry. These questions used to be specific to medicine and psychiatry, and now have become issues, not only depression, but mental health in general, that have spread throughout the entire society. We can say that mental health, ultimately, is the general way our society views the distress and adversity generated by social relationships. I would even say that this is the individualist approach to this type of misfortune.
at any historical moment or in any particular local, cultural, or social world, people have languages of suffering, languages of distress that they use both to understand themselves and perhaps equally importantly to convey their distress or convey their predicament to others. And so depression definitely has come to function on multiple levels as that kind of language. And as I say, as an idiom, it exists in a very loose and almost trivial way, and a person can say, oh, I was so depressed by that movie really depressed me. And they don't mean that they're necessarily, they may not mean that they're in great depth of misery and suffering as a result of that. They just mean that they feel a little bit discouraged and demoralized or just put off aesthetically by that event. So that's an extreme mild end of the spectrum. This is part of the issue, that once things become a kind of lingua franca within a cultural community, they're very elastic and they have a very, very broad use. They're functioning in a sense almost as metaphors for other experiences.
The word depression is a victim of its own success and is now used far beyond the reality of the pathology. Another illness is also now commonly discussed: bipolar disorder, which used to be known as manic depression. It is increasingly showing up in news headlines. Anthropologist Emily Martin has been studying it as a metaphor for the values of our contemporary society in her courses at New York University.
I would say, to describe what bipolar disorder is, it's you go through life with the potential of your moods, your happy moods and your sad moods, going to an extreme version of what we would want them to be. And you love the highs, just love them to pieces. They are the best, the most amazing. But while you're in that mode, you have a sort of foreboding that it's almost as if your circuits are sparking and you're likely to blow a fuse. You just get this feeling that it's too much and you kind of can't stop it. And eventually you crash. And there is almost beyond words, partly because when you are depressed, you lose language. You can't formulate your thoughts. You become inarticulate. You feel just like a black hole of misery. Hi, Will, welcome. Give you a chance to warm up. Very cold. I think there's a lot of fantasy about the condition of mania. It has been adopted by the press very widely as a good characteristic, a good way of characterizing extremely successful men. Depression then, in that light, logically, has become associated with lack of productivity, just as, and that may not be the actual depression of anybody. It may not be anybody's real experience of depression, but it's a cultural pairing of high productivity and low or non-existent productivity.
By studying her own disorder from an anthropological point of view, Emily Martin highlights how much the manic, the euphoric side of bipolar disorder, is valued in our society, and how, incidentally, the depressive side is associated with inefficiency and a lack of productivity.
And this is a public health poster from the 1970s, which shows these plaster mannequins are the people who are depressed, and the ones that look like ordinary people are the non-depressed. And so we're supposed to attend to depression as a public health problem in order to improve people's productivity in the workplace, which is only one way that depression could be understood. What does it mean when you calculate the cost of depression to the nation? It must mean people aren't showing up for work. What else could it mean? How else could they come up with a figure of cost to the nation?
When a society is going through a crisis, especially economic crisis, people need more mental health care rather than less. And that is going to serve the community and the countries very well in the future, because you're preserving people's mental health, you are encouraging them to become better, and then they will become productive part of the country's life. They will generate money.
Since 2008, Greece has been in the midst of a serious economic crisis, which has raised the rates of unemployment dramatically, as well as those of depression and suicide. For European Deputy Nikos Chountis, there's a clear connection. In response to the distress of his fellow citizens, he decided to raise the issue of treating mental health with the European Parliament.
According to our official statistics, a suicide occurs every 18 hours in Greece, and a suicide attempt every 45 minutes. The actual figures might be even higher, because the Orthodox Church condemns suicides. This is why they are not all declared as such. And I repeat, it is the crisis that is the chief cause of this situation. The unemployment, poverty, and misery have aggravated the phenomena of depression so much that they now lead to suicide.
We all get depressed. We are all depressed. I'm depressed. I have a job that isn't what I did before, that I didn't know. I had another profession. I ran a large clothing manufacturing company. And at the end of my career, to survive, I had to change jobs because of the crisis and its impact. Personally, I found the courage to fight. I don't know for how long, but I found it. Other people don't have this strength.
This place right here used to be full of activity. Everyone who worked in the field of mental health came here to take training courses. It's over now. Beyond the figures, the numbers and the statistics, I can say that what we're living every day, in our families, our jobs, has changed, and everything now looks grey. Personally, I first noticed it in my work with my patients, most of whom show symptoms of depression. Families are very strong here. But sometimes, when there is no family, or when the family doesn't have the means to help, then the individual no longer knows how to cope, including psychologically. That's the time when medication can be prescribed, and sometimes it provides relief.
Γραμμή βοήθειας για την κατάθλιψη, παρακαλώ.
Θέλω να μιλήσω λίγο σε κάποιον, θα μπορούσα να μιλήσω σε εσάς.
Ναι, πείτε μου.
Δεν ξέρω τώρα πού να αρχίσω. Έχω έντονα προβλήματα αϊτμίας εδώ και αρκετούς μήνες. Δεν κοιμάμαι. Κοιμάμαι μετά τη μέρα για αρκετές ώρες. Δεν έχω ρίξει για τίποτα. Είμαι ένα άδειο σακί. Αν το αφήσεις κάτω θα πέσει. Θέλω να σας πω, είμαι σε μια πολύ άσχημη κατάσταση. Υπάρχουν κλάματα, Δεν υπάρχει επιθυμία για τίποτα. Εδώ και αρκετούς μήνες είμαι άνεργος. Γενικώς δεν μου έχει βγει τίποτα.
When economic conditions create despair and hopelessness, create shame, create feelings that you can't care for your family, that are intolerable to your sense of who you are as an adult, that create feelings that things will never be good again, you're going to get people contemplating suicide. That's not a disorder necessarily in itself. It's not a depressive disorder, certainly. What your culture offers you in terms of hope, in terms of pride, in terms of the ability to do what you think is minimal for a decent human life, that will have an impact on suicide rate. And in Greece right now, there's such despair. Many people feel this is maybe the only way out, but I would argue that jumping to the conclusion that most of them have clinical depression is without warrant.
It's no small thing. It's harmful to explain the effects of a war waged against a population in medical and psychiatric terms. In other words, I would not have accepted a psychiatric, psychological explanation of our resistance against fascism. There is no reason to psychoanalyze the effects of this macroeconomic horror. As shrinks, our responsibility is not to psychoanalyze. In other words, because we are psychoanalysts, we are well placed to know that we must not psychoanalyze life.
It takes a very articulate, very political person to stand up and say, no, it's not just me. It's something about the situation. It's something about this and this. And I'm willing to say that it's happening to me because I don't feel that it's just my personal weakness as a human being. So instead, it's better to, if you adopt this very common psychological idiom, then there's a kind of commonality. You don't feel you're singled out now, but in a different way. It's like, yes, this is the problem. Everybody has this problem. We all get. In Quebec, we had a kind of epidemic, as you had in other places, we had an epidemic of burnout. So it was okay for people to say, I'm burned out. What is this? Well, maybe it's depression, but it also implied there's something about my work situation that's very demanding and very distressing and so on. But it's still not a very political way of saying, wait a minute, why am I burned out? What's wrong with my work situation? That it's an inhuman pace, or that it does not give me enough sustenance, or that would be equally perhaps true picture of the story, but it comes back to the individual. And again, people have argued that throwing it back to the individual suits the economic system very well, because then we can say, fine, so it's you, and now we have various products and various activities and various services you can avail yourself of, so you can get yourself back up to being a good functioning unit within this larger system. And again, what's disquieting about the whole thing is how it shunts off the more careful analysis and response to the larger configuration of things. You could say that the opposite of the highly psychologized, individualized suffering person is Occupy Wall Street, kind of. It's the people talking back to the system and saying, wait a minute, there are things about the system that are profoundly demoralizing and disempowering to all of us, and we don't want that anymore. We want to change that.
Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, said medical science is making such remarkable advances that pretty soon none of us will be well. And he introduced the concept of soma into Brave New World, that people got through the day taking a pill that made them happy.
You could ask, so what is it about the way that we're living that's conducive to depression? And if there are problems with the way we're living, if there's something about consumer capitalism, about achievement-oriented society, about being overloaded all the time with stimulation and with messages to consume and so on, if those turn out to be things that are problematic, do we want to hide from that? Do we want to just say, no, it's no problem, just take this pill and you can put up with this difficult social environment we've created for ourselves?
It's the statistics from the American government that say amongst women in their prime, between, let's say, 30 and 50, about a quarter of them are now at this moment on antidepressants. Not in their lifetime, at a given moment, about a quarter of all those women are on antidepressants.
In France, do all of the undergraduates take amphetamines? They do here. If there were a class of undergraduates here from NYU and they could speak freely, we would probably find out that, I don't know, 8 of 10 of them take amphetamines. And if that isn't doping, I don't know what is.
We don't have the right to be tired. We never have the right to be tired, and increasingly so. What is interesting is to see how depression operates as a socially accepted excuse for fatigue. One of the major rights we need to have is the right to be tired.
And the right to be sad.
And the right to be sad, which does indeed go with it.
Human nature is incredibly constant. Our world does not have more severely depressed people today than it did in the past. What has changed is our way of understanding our distress. By constantly requiring us to be highly effective, our society does not allow for sadness, worry, melancholy, mourning, which it medicalizes in excess. But do we really have to obey? Subscribe to this contemporary myth? Perhaps it's time to reinvent a different one.
Και δεν ξέρω πώς θα πάω αυτή την κατάσταση. Και νιώθω όλο αυτό να έρχεται πολύ πάνω μου, πολύ δυνατά πάνω μου. Και όλη αυτή η κατάσταση βλέπω ότι δεν μπορώ να την φύγω από το να πίνω, δεν μπορώ να ξεφύγω από το να ξενυχτάω. Πρέπει να ξαναμπω σε μια κανονική ροή. Και έχω ακούσει ότι υπάρχει παραμικρική αγωγή που μπορεί να σε βοηθήσει να νιώσεις πάλι δυνατός.
Ναι, αυτό ισχύει. Μπορείτε να πάρετε δηλαδή κάποια φαρμακευτική αγωγή και όντως σιγά σιγά θα σας βοηθήσει να σταθείτε στα πόδια σας, θα ηρεμήσει λίγο αυτή η άσχημη διάθεση. Με τη σειρά του η άσχημη διάθεση θα βελτιώσει κάτι στο προσφυγικό.